Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Paul Ortiz. He's a professor of history at the University of Florida and a member of the United Faculty of Florida, which is is parented by the Florida Education Association. Paul, before we get into sort of your experience as a union member, and particularly one of a cohort of not just being a union member, but also in terms of your profession under a direct assault by Ron DeSantis and sort of a Republican juggernaut in Florida. Tell us a little bit about the United Faculty of Florida and the FEA.
Yeah. So the United Faculty of Florida first organized, we first really unionized as higher ed faculty in Florida in the early 1970s in response to decades of attacks on professors and teachers. You know, we had professors in Florida who were fired because they publicly criticized Robert E. Lee, because they publicly criticized Warren G. Harding. Remember him? He was president back in the 1920s. And for things like supporting the civil rights movement or for being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And so that's why we originally unionized. So right now, the state of Florida, all of our universities are unionized among the faculty. We have a statewide union, and then each university or college has its local chapter. So I was the chapter president of the University of Florida chapter of the United Faculty of Florida. And we're a part of the Florida Education Association. So the Florida Education Association is that K through 12 teachers union. They have locals in every single county in the state, all 67 counties, and we're the higher ed part of that union, educators union.
Has there been a time, I mean, you mentioned the 70s and LGBTQ rights, and all I can think of is Anita Bryant, but I don't know if she was actually in Florida as much as she was like just associated with the oranges. But has there been a time in your memory and in the history of the union where the union has been under this type of assault, both from a hostility towards unions, but also in particular towards teaching at universities? I mean, this is the guy who started the critical race theory scare hoax, essentially. Chris Rufo is now a college president of a public institution in Florida, essentially placed there to be the model of rooting out liberals, people who talk about wokeism or what they call wokeism, really as a sort of like a centerpiece of Ron DeSantis's now failed campaign. But put this in context to us in terms of what you're going through down there.
We are, we're educators in the Deep South, and the attacks on the rights of our students to learn, to major in whatever topics they want to major in, to study Black history, to study gender studies, labor history. In fact, I mean, those have always been under assault more or less, but the intensity of the assaults kind of ebb and flow. And you're absolutely right. We're under unprecedented attacks. You may have heard that during the last legislative session, the first iteration of HB 999 actually carried a prohibition or a banning of gender studies. And so you began, if you went back a couple months earlier, of course, Florida became notorious because the state banned the AP African American Studies curriculum and really wanted to do more. Obviously, that's just a stepping stone. They came up with the Don't Say Gay bill, and that was just a stepping stone. As everyone knows, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. Book banning has gotten worse. A lot of my former students have become teachers, or I should say used to be teachers in South Florida. They've all left. They've either quit the teaching profession or now they teach in other states because they were increasingly not allowed to teach controversial subjects like Black history, like Holocaust studies, like women's history, like LGBT studies. And so they're gone. And so higher education, the unions are really the last force holding the line. to defend our students' rights to learn whatever they want to learn in college, whatever they feel they want to major in. We had to use our collective bargaining contract to actually save gender studies in higher education, because we told our universities, look, you can't just ban gender studies because we have a collective bargaining contract that has academic freedom articles, and it has also very strict articles about how you can change the terms of employment in our jobs. And so this is why the state has retaliated against us and has ramped things up and is really trying to decertify our public education unions, because they realize that we're the last kind of statewide force opposing this really increasingly fascist attack on the right to learn.
I want to expand more on this, because we've seen, I think, really since the 2011, or I should say more so, since the 2011 Chicago teachers strike, unions adopting a social justice model of unionization, or reviving one, I should say, as opposed to the more managerial one. And it tends to happen, as I've said this before, amongst teachers and nurses first, because of their relationships with their clients, essentially, if you will, and they have an immediate relationship with the community. And so fighting for community issues becomes sort of more integrated into the agenda of the unions. But talk about that, because very often we'll hear the idea of unionism and labor and working class people is that somehow having a social justice agenda is somehow antithetical to fighting for working class people. And I'd like your take on that.
Yeah. I think that's really astute analysis. I mean, I grew up in the working class. I've been a union member most of my entire adult life. And I think, even taking things a step back, I think in the 80s and 90s, the labor movement got away from our roots. And what I mean by this is that in some cases, we did become disconnected from communities, and we kind of pulled in the fences. There was the Reagan era. Everyone knows it was tough on unions. We became very defensive. You mentioned the Chicago teachers strike was a model for many of us, because it reminded us that, as teachers, as faculty members, as staff members of colleges and universities, we are part of the community. And one example would be that for our faculty union, we have never argued that academic freedom is just an issue for professors. We've never argued that we're only talking about things like tenure and our rights in the workplace. Our argument has always been that you have to have, if you want to have any community whatsoever in a democratic polity, you have to have intellectual freedom. If you don't have intellectual freedom, you don't have anything else. And so that's how we've gotten so much support, is really relying on the community and being there for the community. And so my union, for example, whenever there's a push for affordable housing, we're there. Whenever there's a push for raising the minimum wage for all workers, we're there. Whenever there's a push for improving any kind of healthcare systems where we are, we're there, and we should be there, and we never should leave those things. And so those are the types of social justice commitments we have. They're less ideological and more because we are part of the communities that sustain our campuses and schools.
Can you talk a bit about what some of your colleagues and members of your union have gone through over the past few years, particularly if they identify as LGBTQ, what the environment has been like in Florida, given the, conversation about groomers and how the right-wing government, or the DeSantis administration, among others, have tried to target really LGBTQ educators in the state?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. It's been really depressing. It's been devastating. When I was the union president for our chapter, I'm still an officer, but I was a president for 3 years. The attacks on our LGBT faculty, attacks on Chinese and Chinese American faculty, especially after the election of Donald Trump, to talk with my Chinese colleagues here in Florida, actually many of whom have left the state, And they would talk to me not only about being harassed in their colleges and university settings, but they would talk about their children on the playgrounds being harassed by other children because they heard these terrible, and one of them even challenged me. And she said, Paul, when was the last time you ever saw a positive article or media thing about China in the newspaper? It's always negative. It had a really devastating impact. I think that what's depressing for me in terms of thinking about, how do we maintain intellectual freedom in the United States is, I get emails, I get texts from colleagues, especially assistant professors, graduate students who say, Professor Ortiz, I was going to assign Toni Morrison, a book by Toni Morrison, like say Beloved. I was going to assign an article by Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the great law professors of our time. But I know the state is looking especially stringently at Black women scholars. And maybe I won't be able to assign that this semester because I'm afraid, I'm not tenured, I don't have job security. And so there's a constant fear of harassment. And there's what I would call, or what we call here, a lot of anticipatory obedience. And so the state doesn't even have to pass a law saying, oh, you can't read Toni Morrison's Beloved. But guess what? Many school districts have pulled that book off the shelf in anticipation and of fear. And I mentioned earlier that some of my former students who used to teach in Miami-Dade or Broward, who just stopped teaching about controversial topics like the Holocaust during World War II. They stopped teaching about Native American history because it takes one parent now to complain, and the parent doesn't even have to have a child in that class. They just have to find out that topic is being taught in a way that they don't appreciate. And so the principals and school districts no longer back up the teachers the way that our administrators in higher ed no longer back up the faculty. That's why the unions have become so very vitally important.
And you guys have a record of even going beyond that, those defensive measures and trying to provide that space. My understanding is in the wake of Charlottesville, your union also organized against Richard Spencer coming into, I guess it was it Gainesville? Tell us about that.
Thank you for reminding me, because I think that mobilization is really a part of the crisis that we're in now. And so Richard Spencer is a neo-Nazi, as some of your viewers may know. He's a person who advocates ethnic cleansing, which is de facto genocide. You can't have ethnic cleansing in the modern world without using violence. And so he has followers and people who aren't necessarily members of his organization, but people that were following him on these college tours. And so during Charlottesville, many of us remember the violence that took place there, the Spencer followers with their tiki torches marching through residential neighborhoods in Charlottesville, chanting "Jews will not replace us," and other hateful anti-Semitic and racist chants. So in Gainesville, we decided we weren't going to put up with that. And so the union really mobilized in advance. We sponsored and co-sponsored teach-ins to try to bring into focus intersectionality. And this is another thing that the state of Florida hates for us to talk about. That's a code term that they hate. But we use it to talk about the connections between anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, and many forms of oppression that Richard Spencer was supporting. And so we actually were able to, as a union, to be part of this great alliance of Jewish students, Muslim students, Christians, atheists, you name it. It was kind of it was a great Heinz 57 kind of coalition. And we're very proud of the fact that we retired Richard Spencer about a week or so after his failed trip to Gainesville, and none of his followers came marching through our neighborhoods with tiki torches, because we told them in advance, you're not going to do that. And again, it gets back to what you were saying earlier, the social justice unionism part of our work. We're not just about what happens in the workplace. Do we have collective bargaining contracts? Yes. Do we have a grievance procedure? Yes. And those are very important for us. But equally important was keeping Richard Spencer's fascist followers from marching through our neighborhoods with their torches and assault rifles. So we retired him, and he said a week or two after, he said, it's just not fun anymore. I'm going to stop doing it. And so we're very proud of that. But again, we faced a lot of retaliation for that. The state of Florida didn't like it. Our administration didn't like it. They wanted us to ignore this man and his minions coming through. But we said, we're not going to ignore it because our students really wanted us to step up. You know, it's like our students are saying, if you have fascism and it's staring you at the face, what are you going to do? Like look the other way? And we just can't do that.
Explain to me from, how this sort of embrace of intersectionality, how this strengthens unions and the labor movement.
Well, let me start by talking about why the state doesn't like us talking about intersectionality, because it does exactly that. When I see my interests as connected to yours and to my neighbors, and I begin to understand that unless my neighbor is secure, I'm not very secure. Until I begin to understand that, you know, until my Jewish colleagues feel safe and feel they have a supportive environment, until I understand those things, I'm not really in a safe and supportive environment. And intersectionality is simply understanding the unity of a democratic society. You can't have a democratic society unless all people are free and equal. If you don't have that, then you have an oppressive society. And so on the one level, that's one kind of baseline notion of intersectionality. So if you're talking about workplace discrimination, sure, you can focus on one group because that might be your expertise. Let's just say you focus on, you know, anti-Chinese discrimination in the workplace. Okay, there's a whole literature on that, and it's very important to specialize in that. But unless you understand the connections between that form of discrimination and sexist discrimination in the workplace, and the discrimination against Black workers in the workplace, and the discrimination against all workers, then you're not really getting the whole picture. That's simply the overview of what intersectionality is. The opposite viewpoint is that we're isolated, alienated individuals, that your freedom has nothing to do with my freedom, that we're all just kind of working kind of in a vacuum. And that's what the state of Florida wants us to see now, because that really keeps us disempowered. It keeps us away from each other. An intersectional attitude leads to organizing. It leads to understanding that the state of Florida, or even the United States, doesn't give us rights. We earn those rights, but we can only earn those rights through organizing.
Lastly, is there anything you can tell us that would give us any type of optimism for Florida in any time frame that you choose?
That's a great question. Well, we're holding the line. I think the optimism is that, you know, you mentioned the Richard Spencer thing earlier. When the state passed the ban on AP African American Studies last February, we mobilized statewide. And again, the unions mobilized with the students. We had really wonderful teach-ins, you know, 3-hour teach-ins. Can you imagine college students sitting in a classroom for 3 hours reading and listening to lectures and having fun doing it?
Being the father of a college student, my answer is no. And also having been a college student, my answer is no.
I know, I was so excited. I mean, we have students here in high schools walking out in response to the book banning. And you won't hear a lot about it. You won't see a lot about it because it kind of frankly terrifies adults. But I think that's the optimism, is the younger people, the college, the high school, the middle school students, the parents in Florida are starting to mobilize too. They're starting to really say, okay, well, really, why do you want to ban Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five? Is it really because there is sex in the book, or is it because the book is anti-war? Because, you know, we've seen that before. So there's a lot of cause for optimism. I think we just have to hold our unions together. And the last thing I'll mention along that is, you know, if you're in a play, if you're watching this now and it looks like, oh my gosh, Florida's terrible, I'm so glad I don't live there, don't do that, because it's coming your way. Yep. Because this model of divide and conquer that Ron DeSantis is brilliant at doing. Now, he may have lost his presidential bid, but that ideology of dividing us, of getting me to distrust you, of getting you to distrust me, that's his bread and butter. And that's a politics which unfortunately continues to resonate.
Paul Ortiz, professor of history at the University of Florida. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on the Majority Report. It's been a great honor. Thank you.
Paul.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.